billionaire came home without warning. What he saw between his son and the black maid changed his life forever. Marcus Hale was a billionaire who owned skyscrapers, tech companies, and half the city's skyline, but not his own time. For 3 years, business kept him traveling non-stop. Meetings in Dubai, deals in London, nights in penthouse hotels that felt colder than empty houses. One evening, without informing anyone, not even his staff, Marcus decided to return home early. He wanted to surprise his son, Ethan, an 8-year-old boy who had grown quiet since his mother passed away. As Marcus opened the front door of his massive mansion, laughter echoed through the hallway, laughter that stopped him cold. Ethan hadn't laughed like that in years. Marcus followed the sound and froze. Marcus froze at the threshold of the living room, his hand still resting on the cold metal of the door handle, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation, because the scene in front of him did not fit the rigid, orderly world he had built for himself and his son. Ethan was on the floor, legs crossed, a paintbrush clutched in his small fingers, bright streaks of blue and yellow smeared across paper, his shoulders relaxed in a way Marcus had not seen in years, not since before the diagnosis, before the therapists, before the silence had slowly taken over his home. Beside him sat Rosa, the maid, the woman Marcus barely remembered hiring except as a formality through an agency recommendation, a quiet presence meant to clean, cook, and remain invisible. Yet here she was, sleeves rolled up, paint staining her hands, her face lit with a warm, genuine laugh as Ethan spoke in his uneven, excited rhythm. And she listened, not politely, not patiently, but with full attention as if every word mattered. Ethan's voice rose and fell, his hands moving animatedly as he explained the colors, the shapes, the tiny story he was creating on the page, and Rosa nodded, asking soft questions, encouraging him, guiding without controlling, letting him lead. Marcus felt something twist sharply in his chest. Ethan looked alive, truly alive. His eyes were bright, his movements free, his usual guarded tension gone, replaced by a joy Marcus had spent years trying to unlock with specialists, schedules, and expensive programs. Confusion hit first, heavy and disorienting, followed immediately by anger, sharp and possessive, because the sight felt wrong in a way he couldn't yet explain. Why is she sitting so close to him? Why does he look like that with her? Why does my son look happier with a stranger than he ever does with me? His jaw tightened as he stepped fully into the room, the sound of his polished shoes striking the floor louder than necessary, cutting through the laughter like a blade. Ethan looked up instantly, his face breaking into a wide smile that made Marcus's chest ache despite himself. "Dad!" Ethan shouted, scrambling to his feet and running toward him, paintbrush forgotten on the floor, small arms wrapping tightly around Marcus's legs. Marcus stiffened for a fraction of a second before resting a hand on his son's head, his eyes never leaving Rosa. She stood up immediately, her smile vanishing, posture straightening, as if she had been caught doing something wrong, her hands clasping nervously in front of her, paint still visible on her fingers. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, her voice careful, respectful, almost fearful. "We were just painting. Ethan wanted to show me his colors." Marcus said nothing at first. He looked around the room, noticing details he hadn't expected, the paints neatly arranged, the protective cloth spread carefully over the carpet, the absence of chaos or mess. Everything was controlled, intentional, safe. His anger wavered, replaced by something more uncomfortable, uncertainty. He raised his hand slowly, silencing her mid-sentence, his expression cool, distant, the mask he wore in boardrooms and negotiations sliding effortlessly into place. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone clipped and final. Rosa nodded quickly, lowering her gaze, stepping back as if to shrink herself out of the space she had briefly occupied. Marcus knelt slightly, placing his hands on Ethan's shoulders, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. "Go wash your hands," he said gently. "Dinner soon." Ethan nodded, already distracted, humming softly as he ran off toward the sink, leaving faint paint footprints behind. The room fell quiet. Marcus straightened slowly, his eyes returning to Rosa, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. She stood still, waiting, breathing shallowly, aware of the power imbalance hanging heavy in the air. Marcus didn't know what unsettled him more, the fact that she had crossed an invisible boundary he had never clearly defined, or the undeniable truth that in his absence, someone else had reached his son in a way he had failed to. As Rosa quietly excused herself and returned to her duties, Marcus remained in the living room, staring at the half-finished painting on the floor, colors blending imperfectly yet beautifully. A silent accusation staring back at him, forcing him to confront a question he wasn't ready to answer. What exactly had he been missing all this time? Sleep refused to come that night, no matter how many times Marcus closed his eyes or adjusted the silk sheets beneath him, because the image of Ethan on the floor, laughing freely beside Rosa, replayed itself over and over in his mind like an unwanted surveillance loop. Every detail haunted him, the paint on her hands, the way she leaned in when Ethan spoke, the unguarded joy on his son's face. Marcus stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched, his thoughts racing between logic and something far more personal and uncomfortable. By midnight, he gave up on rest entirely and slipped quietly into his study, the soft glow of multiple monitors illuminating the sharp lines of his face as he accessed the home's security system. He watched footage from earlier that day, then the day before, then days going back weeks, his eyes scanning for any sign of misconduct, any excuse to justify the anger he had felt. He saw Rosa arrive early, always on time, her movements efficient and respectful. He watched her keep her distance when therapists were present, never interfering, never overstepping. He saw her speak softly to Ethan, giving him time to respond, never rushing him, never forcing eye contact, never showing frustration. Marcus fast-forwarded through hours of footage, expecting to find something, anything, that would confirm his suspicion, but instead he found himself unsettled by how consistently gentle she was, how naturally she adapted to Ethan's needs without being told. The next morning, Marcus reviewed schedules, cross-checking her assigned duties, looking for deviations, hidden patterns, private moments that shouldn't exist. Everything aligned perfectly. Rosa followed the rules to the letter. If anything, she did more than expected while asking for nothing in return. That disturbed him more than rebellion ever could. By the third day, Marcus seriously considered replacing her anyway. He drafted an email to the agency, fingers hovering over the keyboard, prepared to request a new hire under the guise of household restructuring. But he couldn't bring himself to send it. Something stopped him. Some quiet, persistent doubt that whispered maybe the problem wasn't her at all. That evening, he watched from a distance as Rosa read to Ethan, her voice calm and rhythmic, repeating words patiently when Ethan stumbled, never correcting him sharply, never showing disappointment. Later, when Ethan refused dinner, pushing his plate away as he often did, Rosa didn't argue or call for Marcus. She simply sat beside him, broke the food into smaller pieces, turned the moment into a game, and waited. Eventually, Ethan ate. Marcus watched silently, a knot forming in his chest. That night, through the hallway camera, he saw Rosa sit beside Ethan's bed long after the lights were out, humming softly, her presence steady until his restless movements slowed and sleep finally claimed him. Marcus felt something crack inside him, an emotion too complex to name. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. The next day, unable to contain his confusion any longer, Marcus called the house manager into his office, his tone controlled but strained. "What changed, my son?" He asked flatly, expecting a complicated explanation involving therapy techniques or developmental milestones. The house manager hesitated only briefly before answering, sir." The simplicity of the response irritated Marcus. He dismissed the man with a nod, unconvinced, his instincts still screaming that trust was dangerous, that miracles always came with a hidden cost. That was when he decided to test her, quietly, methodically. Marcus chose a watch from his private collection, a limited edition piece worth more than Rosa earned in an entire year, and placed it deliberately on Ethan's bedside table, half hidden but clearly visible to anyone tidying the room. He said nothing. He told no one. Days passed. Marcus checked the camera footage obsessively. Rosa entered the room daily to clean, to organize, to help Ethan dress, her hands passing within inches of the watch every time. She never touched it, never paused. Never looked twice. The watch remained exactly where Marcus had left it, but while the object stayed still, something else began to shift in ways Marcus couldn't ignore. Ethan began speaking more, forming longer sentences, expressing preferences, even initiating conversations without prompting. He smiled more often. He laughed out loud. He started waking up excited instead of withdrawn, his world expanding beyond the careful walls Marcus had built around him. Watching from afar, Marcus felt the unsettling realization sink deep into his bones. His test had failed, but not in the way he expected. Rosa had passed without effort, without awareness, and in doing so, she had exposed something far more dangerous than theft, the truth that his son was healing, and that the person making it possible was someone Marcus had never intended to truly see. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hallway as Marcus walked past Ethan's room, his thoughts elsewhere, when a quiet exchange made him slow his steps. He hadn't meant to listen. He hadn't meant to stop. But his son's voice, clearer than it had ever been, held him in place. "Rosa," Ethan asked gently, his words careful but confident, "why are you always so patient with me?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. He leaned slightly closer to the door, the sound of crayons faint in the background, his instincts telling him he was about to hear something he wasn't prepared for. There was a pause, long enough that Marcus wondered if Rosa would deflect the question the way adults usually did. Instead, her voice came softly, layered with something heavy and restrained. "Because I had a son once," she said. Marcus's breath caught. "He passed away," Rosa continued, her tone steady despite the pain underneath it. "And helping you helps me heal." The words hung in the air, fragile and irreversible. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing as memories collided, of empty rooms, of silence, of nights when Ethan cried and he answered with solutions instead of comfort. Inside the room, Ethan processed the words quietly before replying, "I'm glad you're here." Rosa smiled, though Marcus couldn't see it, but he heard it in her voice when she said, "So am I." Marcus stepped back as if burned, his heart pounding, shame creeping in like a slow poison. For months, he had seen Rosa as a role, a function, a line item in a contract. Never once had he asked her story. Never once had he wondered what she carried with her into his home each day. That evening after dinner, after Ethan had gone to bed calmer than usual, Marcus found Rosa in the kitchen, carefully drying dishes, her movements quiet and deliberate. He stood there longer than necessary before speaking, his voice lower than it had ever been with her. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. Rosa turned slowly, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something resigned. She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars, at the water still clinging to her skin. "I'm just the maid, sir," she said softly. "You hired me to clean, not to feel." The words struck Marcus with more force than any hostile takeover, any courtroom defeat, any financial collapse he had ever endured. They pierced straight through the armor he had built around himself, exposing a truth he could no longer avoid. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but he couldn't, because she was right. He had built his life on control, efficiency, and distance, believing money could compensate for presence, believing provision was the same as love. He looked around the kitchen, then beyond it, imagining the rest of the mansion, the polished floors, the priceless art, the echoing halls where footsteps sounded lonely even when the house was full. For the first time, Marcus saw his home clearly. It was big, it was rich, and it was empty, empty of laughter until recently. Empty of warmth, until Rosa's quiet grief had intertwined with his son's fragile world. Marcus felt something shift deep within him, something irreversible. He realized that while he had been guarding his wealth obsessively, he had failed to protect the most valuable thing he had, his son's heart. And now, standing there across from a woman he had once barely acknowledged, Marcus understood that the true transformation hadn't begun with therapy or discipline or rules. It had begun with shared loss, shared patience, and a kind of love that didn't ask permission to exist. The realization came to Marcus slowly, painfully, like a truth rising from deep water where it could no longer be ignored, because for the first time in years, he allowed himself to sit still and look honestly at his life instead of managing it. He had given Ethan everything money could buy: elite tutors trained in the latest developmental techniques, shelves filled with toys designed to stimulate learning, specialists flown in from different cities, routines built with military precision, yet none of it had filled the quiet space inside his son. Marcus had believed that providing was the same as loving, that success in the world could substitute for presence at home, but watching Ethan now, calmer, brighter, more alive, he understood how deeply wrong he had been. Rosa had given his son what no contract or paycheck ever could. She had given him time, sitting beside him without rushing. She had given him care, meeting him where he was instead of forcing him to adapt. She had given him love, quiet and unconditional, without expecting progress reports or measurable results. That night, long after the house had gone silent, Marcus stood outside Ethan's bedroom door, his hand hovering uncertainly before he finally pushed it open. The room was dim, lit only by a small night lamp, shadows dancing softly across the walls. Ethan lay awake, tracing patterns on his blanket, his breathing slow and steady. Marcus felt a tightening in his throat as he sat carefully beside the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, a simple action that somehow felt heavier than any decision he had made in a boardroom. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Marcus whispered, the words trembling despite his effort to stay composed. He hadn't rehearsed them. They came from a place he had avoided for years. Ethan turned toward him, his expression thoughtful rather than confused, and without hesitation, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around Marcus's chest. The contact startled Marcus, his body stiffening before slowly relaxing as he returned the embrace, holding his son as if afraid he might disappear. "I wasn't lonely anymore," Ethan said quietly, his voice clear and certain. "Rosa helped." The simplicity of the statement broke something open inside Marcus. He closed his eyes, shame washing over him in waves as memories surfaced. Missed dinners, cancelled outings, nights when he chose conference calls over bedtime stories, mornings when he left before Ethan woke up and returned after he slept. He had judged Rosa from a distance, reduced her to a role, questioned her intentions, and nearly removed her from their lives out of fear and pride. And in doing so, he had almost taken away the one thing that had saved his son from retreating further into silence. Marcus sat there long after Ethan drifted to sleep, listening to his steady breathing, his mind replaying every moment he had misread, every assumption he had made. He understood now that authority without empathy was hollow, that wealth without warmth was meaningless, and that love required showing up even when it was uncomfortable, even when it exposed his own failures. For the first time since becoming a father, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden to manage, but as a bond to nurture. He rose quietly, turning back at the door to look at his sleeping son, making a silent promise to himself that the man who walked out of that room would not be the same one who had walked in. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight spilling through the tall windows of the dining room as Marcus stood at the head of the table, his posture different from before, less rigid, less guarded, as if something inside him had finally softened. Rosa stood across from him, hands folded politely, clearly unsure why she had been called in so early. The house staff lingered at a respectful distance, sensing that this moment mattered. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice steady but sincere. "Want to make something clear," he began, meeting Rosa's eyes directly instead of looking past her as he once had. "You are no longer just the maid in this house." Rosa's expression shifted with surprise, confusion flickering across her face as Marcus continued, explaining his offer: childcare supervisor, full authority over Ethan's daily care, triple her current salary, benefits, and the respect her work deserved. To Marcus, it seemed like the only logical correction for his past blindness. But Rosa shook her head gently, her refusal calm and unshaken. "I don't need titles," she said softly. "I just want Ethan to be okay." The simplicity of her answer humbled Marcus more than any rejection ever had. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth in her words. "You've already done what I couldn't," he admitted, his voice lowering. "You showed up." From that moment forward, the house itself seemed to breathe differently. Marcus began coming home earlier, cancelling meetings that once felt untouchable, choosing to sit on the floor with Ethan instead of behind a desk. He listened, not just to his son, but to Rosa, to the rhythms of the home, to the quiet needs he had ignored for years. Laughter returned to the hallways. Meals were shared instead of scheduled. The mansion, once impressive but hollow, slowly filled with something money could never purchase. Marcus discovered that wealth no longer defined him, not the cars, not the contracts, not the influence. What defined him now were the small moments, reading beside Ethan at night, hearing his son speak with growing confidence, watching Rosa smile without fear. He understood at last that the greatest lesson of his life had not come from a mentor, a rival, or a triumph, but from someone he had almost overlooked entirely. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones we never notice, until they save what matters most.